We want to welcome everybody to this Emerging Scholars Network conversation. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to those who are joining us as part of the InterVarsity Faculty Ministry Summer Series. My name is Bob Truby, and I serve as the National Director of the Emerging Scholars Network, a ministry effort within faculty ministry of developing faculty who follow Jesus together. Our conversation today with Dr. Terence Lester concerns Black history in the United States. It's a history that is often buried or whitewashed. Many contend that efforts to focus on that history simply exacerbate racial divisions. Dr. Lester believes otherwise. He experienced the power of learning the history of his own people and believes that learning about our nation's racial history can build understanding and is a step toward building solidarity with one another. Building solidarity goes beyond learning history, and Dr. Lester explores some of the steps we can take in the book we'll be discussing today, All God's Children, how confronting buried history can build racial solidarity. Before we begin, let me just cover a couple of things in terms of housekeeping. For one thing, today we're going to be recording the conversation, and if you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please leave your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the ESN conversation with your video and/or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes. I'll stop the recording now to allow you to disable your video and audio if you prefer not to be recorded. And it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Lester. Let me move to this and apologize here for just a moment here. Well, I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Terence Lester today. He has an earned PhD in interdisciplinary studies from Union Institute and University. He's a minister, speaker, community activist, author, and founder of Love Beyond Walls, a not-for-profit organization that's focused on poverty awareness and community mobilization. His campaigns on behalf of the poor include hashtag love sinks in. And these campaigns have been featured in USA Today, Black Enterprise Essence, and Reader's Digest. They've been viewed by millions of people globally on the Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS News, NBC, Upworthy, and The Bright Side with Katie Couric. His books, in addition to the one we're going to be talking about today, include When We Stand, I See You, Getting Past Stuck, Simple Prayers for Hurting People, and Identity Theft. So, Dr. Lester, we're so glad that you could join us today.
I'm really excited about being here, and thank you for the warm welcome.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us. Well, today, I thought we might start by talking a little bit about Love Beyond Walls, why and how it got started, and the kind of work that you're doing in Atlanta and beyond.
Yeah, so Love Beyond Walls started in 2013. I was actually on staff at a church and was doing all of the pastoral things. And on my breaks, I would literally walk out to the edge of the street, and there was just like a bunch of traffic, people walking, and it was so much vibrancy outside of the four walls of the church. And I remember one day walking back to my office, and realizing that the only time the church was being used and occupied was on 2 days. It was Sunday mornings and a day in the middle of the week, so the choir could come and practice. And I became really frustrated and with the concept of occupying space, but ministry not really happening where life was happening. And so I started to wrestle with this and wanted to really figure out a way where I could embody Jesus and engage people every single day, as opposed to like on the Wednesday evenings or a Sunday morning. And I really started to dream about the ways in which we could engage those who were unhoused. And that's kind of like when the idea about Love Beyond Walls was born, right? How do we engage our neighbors who are poor, who are marginalized, and who are overlooked, who would never probably enter into the doors of a sanctuary, right? And so, with the help of my wife, we co-founded the organization Love Beyond Walls, and one of the first initiatives that we actually launched to launch the organization was my family allowed me to live on the streets for a little over a month. And so I lived under bridges, slept in shelters, was put out of shelters. And I used this time to document ways in which our unhoused neighbors are overlooked and excluded. And that became kind of like the core of what birthed the concept of Love Beyond Walls. Through this campaign, we were able to reunite 16 people with family members, getting them off the
Wow.
streets while I was living underneath the bridge. And we didn't have a budget or anything, but months following became this groundswell of people who were believers and non-believers wanting to really focus their attention on how could we stand in solidarity with our unhoused neighbors. And that kind of became the thrust of how Love Beyond Walls was started. Over the last decade, we've gotten a little over 600 people off of the streets. We've worked to help people recover identification, reunite with family members, gain access to mental health support services, gain access to stable housing, employment, reuniting with children. I mean, the whole gamut, access to sanitation, grooming, and support services. But one of the really driving factors of our organization has always been centered and grounded in relationships, not using a generalization approach to understanding this complex subject of homelessness, but really focusing in on the individual stories that we encounter and learning the ways in which we could stand in solidarity and build relationships with the people before us. And that comes through the work of proximity and presence.
That sounds tremendous. 600 people. That is amazing.
Well,
Well,
praise God. Yeah.
thanks be to God. Well, the book we're talking about today, All God's Children, has the subtitle, How Confronting Buried History Can Build Racial Solidarity. As I mentioned in my introduction, I don't think everybody agrees with you about that. And I wonder, why do you believe confronting this buried history builds rather than undermines solidarity?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I want to start by sharing a story, and then I'll give some more practical or pragmatic answers to this question. I received a text message from my daughter, who is in the 8th grade, when I'm in the middle of a meeting. If you have children, you know how children can be when they want something right now and you're trying to be productive in your workday. And so I received this text message, and my first gut reaction was to, push it aside and put it on pause and respond to it afterwards. But my daughter kept texting, Dad, Dad. I mean, they kept coming back to back to back. So this alerted me to think something more deeply, was going on with her. And so I respond and I say, "Hey, what's going on?" And she says, "I have on my African headscarf today, and I was stopped by a principal, and the principal began yelling at me and wanting me to take off my hat. And she says that only Muslims wear these types of things." And she was saying a lot of derogatory things to my daughter. And I'd respond back with a question that I hate to ask. I asked my daughter, "Is she white?" Um, my daughter, the bubbles come up on the screen and she says, "Yes." And she doesn't understand my history and our heritage. So I paused the meeting because as a parent, I'm concerned with her and her development and her racial identity because she's starting to understand like who she is as a young Black woman and her role in society and what that means to exist in society and culture. Um, and two, I wanted to have a conversation with the assistant principal to see if there was some educational gaps there, right? And so I drive over to the school, I stop my meeting, and uh, luckily I was able to get a meeting with the assistant principal, and we sit down in the conference room, and I ask her a question. I say, "Do you know the history behind African head scarves and head wraps for Black women?" And she says candidly, "No, I don't." I say, "Well, do you know that head scarves and head wraps were one of the only pieces of garments that actually made it through the Middle Passage? And once, those who were being enslaved, mainly women, got to the New Americas, when they got to the New Americas, those who were enslaving Africans actually used headscarves and head wraps to denote that or to signify what women were the property of those who were enslaving them." And she says, I had no idea. And I say, in recent years, Black women, uh, Black people in general have kind of reclaimed this heritage to wear some of these things to signify that we're not defined by enslavement, but these were kind of native to our history and culture. And I talked a little bit about the Crown Act and all of those things. And she says, I had no clue. And she calls my daughter into the office and she looks my daughter in the face. And Zion, uh, she has this like really sorrowful look. She says, "Look at me in my eyes. I want you to know I apologize and I respect your heritage. And it's okay for you to wear this African headscarf." My daughter's like disposition changed. She went from sorrowful to excited
Mm.
about being encouraged and having her Black identity affirmed. I use that story as a backdrop because I think education is important. Um, education within itself is to lead a person or people to this heightened sense of awareness, and I think education can become a vehicle for developing empathy, for understanding a person's story, not uh, solely about um, who they are as a person, but it gives us a greater understanding to understand their social location, how they socially emerged, what has influenced and shaped who they are as people. And it gives us a perspective that sometimes if we're not aware of certain historical concepts, can move from something that is being harmful towards a person to really being aware in the ways in which we mitigate uh, harm or violence or pain or any of the things that could cause harm in a person. And I like this story, which I talk about further in the book, because in this moment of understanding history, not only was this principal able to appreciate history, but she was made aware of her blind spots, so to speak, or the spots that she was unaware of. In the book, I call it inattentional blindness related to a study done by a psychologist. But not to be ableistic, I would say inattentional ignorance, right? And how we sometimes show up in the world and we can cause harm if we are unaware of some of the cultural dynamics. The second part to this, I would like to just offer up as we continue to dialogue, is we really have to like wrestle with some of the things that really shape um, how we see each other, how we see God, how we see the world, right? We have cultural and religious upbringings, religious traditions and cultural upbringings that have provided a framework with how we understand and interpret the concepts of God, but also the concepts of who our neighbors are. We have the historical shaping, right? That has influenced the way that we view social events that are happening currently, but also how we have viewed historical events. We have to really wrestle and ask the questions, through what lens were we taught these things, right? Was this through a lens of a revisionist type of history, or were these accurate depictions of that history? And then we have personal experiences where we are kind of gleaning information from the people, our environment, our social locations who we've been around, how we've seen other people interact and engage with other people. And then lastly, I think how we have engaged ourselves with individuals. All of those are important components of what I would argue as, ways in which we really need to grapple with history so we don't replicate the harm that has been done.
Hmm. Hmm. That's excellent. By the way, I should mention one of the things you do so well throughout your book is tell stories that illustrate the ideas, and it makes for a great read. Um,
Oh,
you
thank you.
you talk about your own journey in understanding Black history, racial history, and that you were not taught in school. What was that like for you? What was that journey like for you of understanding that buried history?
Yeah. Um, I really wrestle with this a lot now, if I'm honest.
Mhm.
As a, Black man, 40 years old, who has done a considerable amount of research now, building a independent library, then going through school. I really wrestle with um, looking back at history. Like if we look at, we just celebrated Juneteenth. We also just celebrated Independence Day. But if you look through history and you look during the framework of Reconstruction era all the way post the Great Depression, there's a long history of how Black people are being depicted in school books, and how they are kind of driven by this narrative that is being architect, right? Or constructed by white historians and white educators, and how it's really being used as a way to exclude Black history, um, and kind of create this narrative that Black persons are, kind of inferior and second class. And, there's tons and tons of research out there that really looks at this, and examines how history was, left out of textbooks. And that was intentional. Dr. LeGarrette King, he's a distinguished professor and historian. He writes about this in his research, when Lions write history, and he kind of looks at the intentional removal of Black history. I started to learn Black history from my grandparents. And those came in the form of talks. And if you are an African American, or if you have relationships with Black people, you know what a talk is if you've ever had this conversation. A talk is when a Black child is made aware of how the social construction of race or their Black skin will impact them as they, navigate society and culture. I remember the first time I was 10 years old and I was sitting across the table from my grandfather. I can still remember like looking at his hands and seeing the years of work, and I can still smell the breakfast of my grandmother was cooking. But he looks at me and he says, "It's the first time I ever heard this. You know, you're going to be treated differently because of your skin color." I mean, it was like drinking from a fire hose because, I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? And then he goes on to talk to me about Emmett Till. Or I remember conversations with my other grandfather who is still alive to this day, who talks to me about how, he was actually brutally beaten by the KKK,
Mm.
and he was hospitalized for over a month. Or my 91-year-old grandmother, who just came to our organization 9 days after she turned 91. She's very sharp in mind. And she stood in the museum that we created that what raises awareness for those who are unhoused. And she's looking around and she says, "I remember a time where I couldn't even go to a museum." She was born in 1932. And she says, "I remember when we got old, beat up, school books." Or she would name a part of the town that she couldn't go in, or a very famous store that is, frequented by all sorts of people from all different diverse backgrounds that Black people could not work in. And she's recanting all of these powerful stories to me. And I'm left with the question, why didn't I learn these things during school? Carter G. Woodson says one of the greatest reasons why he created Negro History Week, which became Black History Month, is because he believed that if you rob people or a people group from the opportunity to draw inspiration from their history and their heritage, then you are doing the people group a disservice, or you're keeping them uninspired, or you're causing and adding to the suffering that they're encountering. And for me, as I've journeyed to discover parts of my own history that I'm still discovering to this day, um, it has empowered me in ways where I feel more affirmed of who I am. It has empowered me in ways where I'm able to show up and educate my children, not just giving them talks that causes fear, but it has given me precision in how I speak directly to their potential. I'm able to affirm the image of God in them, and I'm able to talk to them about ways in which they can navigate space, not being in isolation, but being in the company of all different diverse backgrounds of people without losing their sense of self.
Mm. Thank you. I I know you mentioned the talk, and I I think when I first learned about that, it was an eye opener for me because I realized I had a son and I never gave him that talk. I
Mm,
never had to, never thought that I would need to. And
mm,
uh and to realize that uh every every Black young man and woman hears that talk, uh uh and just how different uh the situation is, just created an awareness for me uh that was just very, very powerful as I thought about my own, you know, my own parenting and the difference. Well, I wonder if you might talk a
yep,
little bit about solidarity. That's the other big idea, it seems, in your book, and that you speak quite a bit about, and how we build that. With, I think, learning buried history being, it seems to me, a first step uh, in that building solidarity. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about solidarity.
yeah. Well, thank you for also sharing part of your story and journey about the talk. And I think one of the things that we also have to realize that we've all been given a talk in some way, right? Um, whether indirectly or directly. And when I talk about building solidarity, I'm talking about it in a way that gives us an opportunity to really um, think and reflect about how we have been proximate to our neighbors. When Jesus talks about loving God with everything and then loving our neighbor as ourselves, when I read that verse, a few things strike me really pointedly. One, uh, Jesus is talking about how the love of God actually empowers us to show up and display that love to those that we're in proximity with. The other thing that's really striking to me is that when Jesus is making this statement, it appears to be that Jesus is not necessarily talking about people who are like us, but he's talking about loving people who are unlike us. And when I think about the word term neighbor, I don't necessarily interpret that as something that suggests someone with an address that is close to us, but somebody that we are in close proximity with. And when we get a chance to fully love neighbor, we're called to love um, who they are as a person. We're called to explore what has shaped them. But neighbor emerges from a neighborhood. And we're also
Mhm.
called to love the neighborhood that the neighbor has emerged from. And if we're called to love the neighborhood, then we're also should be concerned with the issues that that neighborhood faces. And so when I think about solidarity, I think about it in terms of proximity, awareness, but also immersion. In the book, I give a solidarity framework that I've seen not only in scripture, but I've seen that has built and established long lasting relationships. I'll never forget, I was on a podcast and it was one of my friends, he's a white guy, uh, Christian background, and we were having the whole, racial reconciliation, racial justice conversation. And towards the end of the podcast, he asked me a question. He says, "How do I, um, you know, build these relationships?" And I asked him a question in return, and I said, "Well, what do you do in your normal everyday life?" He says, "All of these things." And it did not involve being proximate to the very people group that he said that he
Mm.
wanted to be in relationship with. And I said, "Hey, man, that's your problem. I don't think there's a willingness issue. I think there's just the availability issue or the proximity issue." And he says, "What do you mean?" I said, "You named your favorite coffee shop. That's not even where Black people are. You name your favorite business. That's not where Black and brown people are." And I said, what if you just took a couple days out of the week and you shifted and you went and frequented spaces that may be unfamiliar to you and see what comes of it?" I talk about this in the book and how he started to visit this coffee shop. He established a relationship with an older Black gentleman, and now they become buddies. And this older Black man is giving them wisdom on parenting, and they're sharing stories. But during that process, he talked about lamentation and how sometimes the conversations would lead to lament. And I think that is a part of solidarity work. It's biblically clear that we are to lament with our neighbors, that lamentation within itself communicates our sufferings and our groanings and our doubts and our hopes. And we get a chance to lament with others. And I think lamentation is a healthy way to make our petitions known to God, but also to stand in solidarity with people who are around us. And then I think it's listening, but listening without this idea of censorship. Because I, as a Black man, have been in spaces that were predominantly white, and I was asked to come and do the talks on, racial reconciliation. But people wanted to listen to me, but they also wanted to censor the things that were grieving my heart. And I think if we could create healthier spaces where people can lament and where we can listen, listening within itself builds the connection and community, right? Think of the last time you got into a conversation with someone who is really close to you and how listening drew your heart together. I mean, it's biblical to listen. The book of James talks about how listening is a part of ministry, you know. Then I think it's learning from others. And it's not just creating opportunities where we create the diversity or racial reconciliation conversations where we invite Black and brown people to the table and we, make them teach us everything that we need to know. No, it's building those types of relationships where learning can happen automatically, organically out of building of the relationships that we have. And I think that creates this avenue for us to fully immerse ourselves into the world of others. I can tell you the amount of times where, I've had some of my closest friends who are white come into my space and just stand with me. And this is what I talk about in the book, find another's table to sit at, right? Just last year, I was in a car accident with my wife, which left me in the hospital for an entire month. We had gone out to celebrate with some of our friends, sort of an achievement that we had within our organization. And we left, and I asked my wife to drive. And I woke up on the ground with EMTs running over to my body, and I remember one saying, flip him over to see if he's still alive. I look up and I see the mangled car and my wife limping around to make it over to my body. And I had no idea that I would have 2 emergency surgeries. I would be left after the surgeries not being able to walk. And having to spend a month in the hospital. When I got out of the hospital, I was not able to walk. It was a task for me to learn how to walk again. There was a friend of mine whose name is Dr. Jerome Libba. He's a very close friend. He's white, and he saw the story. He has a private practice. He came to my house 4 months straight every single Sunday and spent 4 hours with me, helping me to walk, standing with me in my pain, having all of these deep conversations, immersing himself in the context of my family, becoming family. Mm. And man, that was just like one of the greatest examples of what it meant to be in solidarity and stand with someone who is suffering. And I'm able to walk today because of his sacrifice. Even if we just use that simple concept of what it means to be proximate and stand with people and not always have answers, but journey with them through, you're able to show compassion and stand alongside others, and you're able to use your voice to really speak truth in ways in which to help social change to occur. And I know I said a lot there, but I see solidarity as a vehicle to really mirror what God is communicating throughout Scripture. Is to love neighbor as self. It's to be concerned with the neighborhood that the neighbor is emerging from, but it's also to figure out ways in which we can have Samaritan eyes and get close to people in ways that we really display the gospel.
Yeah. That Samaritan didn't just stay on the other side of the road and tweet about the terrible conditions on the road and this person had gotten hurt.
Right.
There it is. Hey, we're going to take a break here and just let people know how they can get your book. And then we're going to go into some audience question and answer. So if those of you who are with us want to put questions in the chat, this is your time to do it.
Awesome.
So the book we're talking about today is called All God's Children by Dr. Terence Lester. And you can actually purchase it at InterVarsity Press for a 30% discount using the link that we will put in the chat. And when you check out, just use the code ESNWEB, ESNWEB, up until July 27th, and you can get a 30% discount along with free shipping on the books. So that's better than you can do at Amazon. So I would stop by InterVarsity Press and pick that up. Let me put that in the chat here, and we will move into some audience Q&A. All right, there we go. And let's see, we have one question already here. Steve makes the comment, wonderful educational talk, thank you. Dr. Lester, this is part of a national conversation in lament, fear at times, and opportunity. Can you comment on the Christian approach calling opportunities with these issues? May God bless our efforts. That's a fairly broad question, but please feel free if you have some further things you'd add to that.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for your comment, and also thank you for the question. And I feel the tension in what you're getting at. It was late last night. I got an article that talked about what's happening in the state of Florida with book banning and the exclusion of Black history, and this new amendment, which really restricts ways in which Black history is taught in the school system. And there was this interesting line that emerged from this addendum to this policy that said, we'll talk about those who were enslaved, but we'll make sure to include that they benefited and gained the types of benefits that prepared them for success or something like that.
Oh.
And it just really blew my mind. In thinking about the ways in which we talk about subjects and we use framing and all of these things to either have greater complicit bias, where we only want to talk about things that are central to us, or we have affinity bias, where we only want to be around people who are just like us, or we have implicit bias, where we have taken years and years of like embedded ideas about people groups, and we kind of allow that to be the core of how we respond to people, even if we don't or are not cognitively aware about it, right? And so I think one of the things that we have to model as Christians is being vulnerable in public to say, I don't know, but let me refer to scripture and wrestle with some of these things in ways that are healthy, to allow the gospel to speak just by how we wrestle. And let me give you this point. If you were to go on Google right now and you Googled Christianity, or you Googled, Jesus, or you Googled some of these things in relationship to some of these social issues that we're talking about, a bunch of articles would come up that are very negative, derogatory, and Christianity is being viewed as a religion that is hateful, due to nationalism and racism and some of the examples that we have seen. And I think the opportunity is to say, how can we as Christians lean in like Jesus? How can we go into areas that that are not even a part of who our culture, and really engage with people who may be from have different beliefs or different backgrounds, and really stand as light, um, you know, in ways in which we are able to honor the image of God in every single person. I think Christian intellectualism is really needed right now, where we are able to talk about issues, but not from a demeaning way, and really engage in concepts and ideas where we're able to stay true and core to who we are, but we're able to show a level of respect and dignity and honor in the ways in which we talk about subjects, because I haven't seen that model really healthy. It's either, everybody's going to burn, or we're going to like use our words and our framing to really dehumanize and demean people in a way that is not honoring to God. I don't believe. And I think another opportunity is to, you know, not be silent in our churches. Um, Case in point, I'll never forget the day that Philando Castile was gunned down
Mm.
in front of his child. I was heartbroken. I was serving on staff at a predominantly white church. I was the only Black pastor. And I cried. I cried like a baby. And many of my friends did, because when we see, um, you know, forms of racial violence, it produces racial trauma that really affects the Black community collectively and individually. And you know what the response of the church was? I talk about it in the book. I was made to give a talk on a panel with someone else. Nobody checked on my soul. Nobody asked if I was doing okay. Nobody got a pulse of what I was carrying as a Black person. Nobody checked on the community members within the church that were Black and how they were dealing with this, knowing that the church was multi-generational, it was multi-ethnic, and all of these really important, critical things to consider. And there I was on a Sunday morning, grieving in my heart, being made to talk about things to just sweep it under the rug. I think it was a moment for us to really consider and talk about some of the long historical things that leads to these things. I think it was a moment to, um, you know, give an invitation to people to lament instead of rush past. And it was a moment to really not try to solve issues right away, but give space to people to really understand and make the connections of why these things continue to occur. I think we don't do a good enough job at that in our spaces of worship. And that is another opportunity. And I'm rambling, but
Hmm.
that was one of the things that really lifted up
Thanks.
in my heart.
Well, Lillian asks a question actually that is related to what you've just been saying. How do you address the fatigue problem with race talk and other societal ills that plague us?
Yeah.
Because I think
My,
fatigue,
you know,
especially among
my,
Blacks, I think it's especially rough.
yeah, yeah. Well, firstly, my gut reaction is I don't have the privilege of not being a part of that conversation,
Hmm.
um, because I have to deal with it every single day. Uh, I think it was 2019. I was invited to give a talk about compassion uh, in the northern part of Atlanta. Uh, it's metropolitan Atlanta. Several white-led nonprofits, white church leaders. I was being given the opportunity to come and speak about compassion. I was there to talk about compassion. I walk in because, I do work with unhoused individuals. And so sometimes I dress down, I'll have on like t-shirt, jeans, book bag, hoodie, etc. When I walked in, I was greeted with suspicion. These two persons who were at the volunteer table didn't know that I was the speaker. They started asking me, did I belong there? Like all of the normal things.
Mm.
I was like, oh, wow, like, okay, this is different. And so I say no, I walk in. And as always, I normally try to sit off to the side or in the back. I don't try to sit in the front, just to be unassuming because I want to feel the environment and be a part of the celebratory moment of whatever that is and connect with people. And so the announcer goes up and they're introducing me. There's no picture on the screen. And as I'm being introduced, those same two persons who had suspicion of me started to follow me to the stage almost until the speaker turns to me and say, "Oh, there's Terrence right there." And they realize that I'm the speaker. I'm there as a Black man to talk about compassion. They didn't see me as someone who had something to contribute to the community. And so the first part of the question is, how do you handle fatigue? Well, for me, it's been about self care and finding safe space to talk about these things that are ongoing in my everyday life. If I get pulled over today, I still have to put my hands out of the window, even though I hold a PhD, right? If I get on the call and I'm talking to people who don't want to respect me and my title, I was on the call recently and it was all white male PhDs and one middle aged white woman. She called everybody doctor in the group except me, right? And so, they're like little nuanced things that I have to deal with every single day, just personally. And I can't escape the conversation. The other side of that is I think you create some type of um, communal um, care, which is why lamentation is important in the solidarity framework because lamentation is not just about a bunch of complaints and worries. It's also a space to really empty your heart to God, and in return you get courage. In return you get hope. In return you get community. In return you get safety. There is a part of lamentation that I don't think we oftentimes consider is how we are actually filled by crying out, how we're actually moved with more compassion as we show up with vulnerability. That's been a safe haven for me to not get really allow the fatigue and the racism and the things that I face as a Black man in this world to really um, cause me to want to give up because I still believe that restoration is possible. I still believe that solidarity is a vehicle forward. I still believe in the power of togetherness. And I still believe that God truly desires this when I really and truly reflect in scripture. And so it's a lifelong commitment um, to this work. And I think that Jesus' example of, carrying a rugged cross and being scourged and being mocked is a powerful symbol of what it takes to actually be committed to this work. Not sacrificing ourselves in ways that are unhealthy, but the type of commitment it takes to truly raise up the message of God so God can do the work that we all long to desire in our hearts.
Well, I think that's probably a good word for us to end on here today, and to send us out. We do have a number of more questions, but our time is fleeting, and so we will leave the connection open for a few minutes afterwards, and after we end the recording, if people want to stay on and talk. But as long as Dr. Lester's able to stay. Well, thank you so much for a great interview. And one more time, we want to let people know about the book that we're featuring today. And we have already put the information in the chat about how you can order that. Probably the most important thing, if you go to the university website and search for the book, is to use the code ESNWEB20, ESNWEB, and you can get a 30% discount up until July 27th on the book. We also do want to tell you about our next conversation, and that's going to be on August 17th. And the conversation, and we've just put a link into the chat on that. Our next conversation is going to be on a book called Nourishing Narratives, and which is about the power of story in shaping our faith. We've heard that, I think we've experienced the power of story today in Dr. Lester's many stories, and how important story is in understanding our own history and understanding the history of others. Jennifer Holberg is going to be our speaker. She's the chair and professor of English at Calvin University and co-director of the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing. And she's going to be joining us on August 17th at noon. And you have the link in the chat, and you can register for that today if you wish. Finally, we just want to mention we are thankful for all of you who joined us today. Those of you who are part of the Faculty Summer Series, we are really glad that you were able to make this conversation. This conversation was brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network. And if you're interested in knowing more about the work of Emerging Scholars, you can go to our blog at blog.emergingscholars.org and join us for free. Also, we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESNIVCF. And this and other videos are on our, this video will be, and our past conversations are on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/ESNIVCF. And if you subscribe to that, you'll get notifications whenever we have a new one. Last of all, I want to say, first of all, thanks to InterVarsity Press for their assistance in hosting this program. And Dr. Lester, especially, we want to say thanks to you for taking the time to be with us today and to be part of this conversation. It's just been great to hear about your work, your story, and about this book. And I hope many people are able to pick up a copy of it.
Thank you so much. It was a huge honor and blessing to be with you all and just to engage in conversation and storytelling.
Well, likewise. Thank you so much. And we'll end the recording now. And if there are people who want to stick around for a few minutes, we'll change to gallery view. And